All right. Greetings, everybody. I assume that all of us have been taken up by the recent racial strife and conflicts, and that's certainly partly why you're here today and why I'm here today, and what I've been researching on for the last, frankly, 50 years. Let me ask one question, if I could, please. I'd like to take a little survey, very simple survey. How frustrated do you feel at this point with how we can solve these problems, this racial strife? 1 through 5, 5 being the most frustrated. Just give yourself a number, 1 through 5. Would you be willing to share with us what how you've rated yourselves?
Okay, we've got coming in right now a 4 and a 5, Peter.
Okay, very good, very good. All right, we're going to take the survey again later at the end of our discussion. Okay, this phenomenon is not new. This is not just Trump, and it's more than about David Tom, whom we will speak about also. It's got long historical roots. This is global, and I think that in order to talk about the subject, we have to see the whole larger picture, which I would like to talk about a little bit with you. To tell you very briefly, to preface and to make this more human, I'd like to speak a little bit about David Tom. David Tom was a Chinese man who had emigrated to the US. He was a young man from Toishan, China. And when he got to the US, he was only here a couple of years before he developed TB, was put in a sanatorium, started to act strangely. We don't know why. It could have been cultural. It could have been early stages of psychosis, but anyway, he was transferred to a mental hospital where he spent the next 31 years with no diagnosis in his own language, no therapy in his own language, and no one to speak with in his own language for all of those 31 years. It was a tragedy, and he got worse and worse over those years. And we will start to understand what happened with him as we go on, but I'd like to give you the context, a little bit of the context of the era, which was 1951, when David was put in, and what even got us to that era when David was put in the mental hospital. Now, during that period, you have to remember, we were still in the midst of the Chinese exclusion laws, which had started decades earlier, but it was much greater than just Chinese. This was actually an Asian exclusion compendium of laws, and it affected Indians and it affected Filipinos, even though they were citizens. And there were various efforts to reverse the law. The major reason that law was reversed was actually World War II. And we did not reverse this with the best of intentions from our hearts, but it was actually because Japan was using that law to drive a wedge in between the Chinese, who were supposed to be our allies at that time, and the US. So because of that, President Roosevelt pushed to have this law overturned. Well, it turned out, as you could imagine, that that because American hearts were not totally in it, in the change of law, there turned out to be what you might call an Asian Jim Crow system that developed. Even as far back as 1790, there had been a law that said that Asians cannot be naturalized. So even though they supposedly opened up the law and allowed Asians in, there were these sorts of background Jim Crow sorts of measures to keep Asians out. One of the other things they did, for instance, was they said, okay, we're going to base the quota for immigration on the number of people of that ethnicity in your country. So it's not basing it on the population of China versus the population of England. But they said, okay, well, that turns out to 103 people. So that 103 people was they're opening up immigration to the Chinese. Okay, well, that was based upon 1910 census. So in good Jim Crow style, some years later, they said, well, you know what? I think we have too many Chinese people coming in here. We better base this on the 1890 census instead of the 1910 census. And then what they said was, well, this is not only Chinese people from China, but ethnic Chinese from anywhere in the world we're going to include in this quota. And then they said, well, you know what? I think we should start a fee that immigrants have to pay. And as well as that, you have to speak English. You have to be literate in English. Now, let me just remind you, think about the recent news in, I forget how many states now, 29 states or so, that are making restrictive laws to keep people of color from voting, minorities of all sorts, people different than the white majority. And as a matter of fact, these laws were white supremacist 100 years ago, or more than 100 years ago even. It started even in 1790 when I first mentioned the law against Asian people being able to be naturalized. Okay, well, this is the environment that welcomed David to this country. And what happened in those days was that in many ways, people that were different in any way, not only racially, but in any way different from the majority, were incarcerated, sterilized, killed, tortured, killed by slow death, excluded, excommunicated, etc., etc. So who were these people that were different? Well, they could have been poor people, what they called feeble-minded people. They could have been people that had some sort of mental illness. It could have been people of different races, different colors. And now, if you think back in history, again, this was not a new phenomenon. This has gone back from time immemorial into the past. We've probably all read about the insane asylums in the past. By 1951, it was somewhat better, but let me tell you some interesting things about that phenomenon that had evolved through history. It was actually reinforced by religions and later, believe it or not, by science. Scientists picked up this notion too, that the dominant culture is the best culture and the one we need to preserve. It's the pure culture. Again, not a new concept. The Romans thought that power equals good, power equals right. Of course, Mao Zedong said the same thing. That right comes out of the barrel of a gun. And anyway, there was a movement called eugenics. I don't know if you are familiar with that movement, but it was a very, very popular notion and movement that was pushed by social scientists. I hate to say, my profession. The scientists who later latched on to Darwin and misinterpreted Darwin, who did not buy into this theory, but they were saying that the white race, which of course was the dominant one at that time in this part of the world, were the pure race, and all of these other elements, the feeble-minded and the prostitutes and the LGBTQs, they didn't call them that at that time, and all of the different people, the different races and so on, they were inferior and they were sullying the white race. So what do we do with those people? Well, we sterilize them. We put them in asylums, lock them up, and starve them. When we lock them up, we don't give them good food. We don't take care of them. So this is the context in which David was put in the mental hospital. And now I'm saying this was 1951 that he was put in the mental hospital. It was not quite as bad. Oh, I forgot to tell you now, the with this eugenics, one of the most popular books at the time, which was studied in most colleges and universities, was picked up by no less than Adolf Hitler when he was incarcerated in Germany. And he was taken by this book and its eugenics theories. And he thought this book was his Bible. He referenced this book as his Bible. What he did with it was to narrow and focus his superior race to this Nordic Aryan race. And we've all read about and know about the atrocities done by the Nazis. Well, this is where it originates. It was not only Germany, it was the United States as well. And the book and the research was done here. It wasn't done in Germany. This comes from the United States, and Hitler picked it up. And every culture, I would dare to say, in the world was very, very authoritarian and narrow-minded. And this concept of different people are alien, no good. We want to keep them out. We want, they're subhuman. We can kill them. We can conquer them. We should conquer them. Our race, our group is better. Okay, now, do you recognize any of these historical patterns today? You don't have to tell me. I imagine that you do. It's hard to not see that the same kinds of things are happening today. So now let me talk to you a little bit about David's particular case. Again, we go back to David. He was put in the mental hospital. Again, no diagnosis in his own language. He could speak the two major dialects in Chicago at the time, two major dialects, I imagine, still in the United States, spoken by Chinese people: Toishanese, where he came from, Toisan, and Cantonese, spoken by hundreds of millions of people in the world. Very easy to locate in Chicago, in the Chinatown of the day, or in the Chinatowns of today. But that wasn't important to them. Just didn't care about it. Secondly, he was not treated in any way for 31 years in his own language. Moreover, he had no one to speak with in his own language for 31 years. There was no way he could get out for 31 years. During that time, he was abused. He was given the wrong kinds of drugs, probably to keep him silent and to calm him down if he got excited, as they probably did with most of the patients. I have read and heard indirectly from a lawsuit brought against the state mental hospitals what it was like in the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, when finally David was released. And now we're getting up to really close to now. And these things were still going on. And it took a lawsuit to get David out of there. And there were still people in there. Some people spent their lives in there. And David may have spent his life in there if it hadn't been for a couple of kindly aides that decided to take David to a Chinese restaurant. And David talked with the the cook, and the cook said, how come this guy is in the mental hospital? He's talking lucidly, coherently with me. Why is he in there? Well, actually, by that time, David did have a lot of psychotic symptoms, and he was brain damaged as well. But he still had his lucid, coherent moments. So anyway, from those two people, and there was also one out of 31 years, there was one psychiatrist that said in the end that there's something wrong. You know, this guy has not been diagnosed properly. I don't feel completely comfortable. So Cook County Public Guardian got wind of David's case, brought suit against the state mental hospitals, and got David released. And the judge said, you're absolutely right, and we're going to make a settlement with you, but where are you going to put David now? And by this time, after 31 years, David was quite psychotic and manic depressive, schizophrenic, and brain damaged on about a 3-year-old level. So the county looked throughout the entire Cook County. They couldn't find anywhere to put him. Finally, they stumbled upon Little Southeast Asia Center. We were a small storefront at the time, all volunteers. And the director of programs and at the time, and she's been various positions: director of programs, executive director, president. She's now executive director. I'm now president. We both started as volunteers full-time. We were all volunteers at the time of refugees from Southeast Asia. We looked in the community for someone to take care of David. And of course, amongst the refugees who were very poorly educated, no more than a high school degree for 90% of them, and just getting started in this new country, they could not themselves take care of David. So San and I, San was a refugee herself, and one of the refugees, one of the 13 refugees I brought from Vietnam when the country fell to the communists. We were out on one of the last military transports from Saigon. Anyway, finding no one in our community capable, San and I decided, well, I think we better take care of this poor David. So we moved to uptown Chicago, which was a new Chinatown, some people called it. And we thought David would be in his element here and be familiar with the smells and the sights and the tastes and the language, the sounds. So that's exactly what we did. And we took care of David for the next 31 years. And I guess you can see a picture of David on your screen there to the left. That's San, and that's a volunteer at the right-hand side. Now, I want to tell you what the psychiatrist said when David was released and they talked with us. Okay, number one, he cannot survive on the outside of the mental institution. Number two, don't try to teach him anything because he can't learn. Number three, he hasn't learned any English in all those 31 years. He's got to be mentally disturbed. He's got a mental problem. Okay, so let me tell you a few of the things that we discovered. David was released around Christmas, New Year's of 1982, 1983. And one of the first things we did was take David out to a Chinese restaurant. Up on the wall, there was a picture of Santa Claus. I said, David, who is that? David said, Santa Clausy. And we knew that they were wrong. David could speak and he had some knowledge of the world. Okay, there were so many instances that I just have to share some of these things with you that left mud in the faces of the psychiatrists and the whole system, the prejudices, the bigotry against people who are different, just assuming that they don't know anything. Now, I want you to try to keep in mind, not just David when I'm talking about these things, but this same phenomenon happens with the Native Americans. They're dumb. They don't know anything. We're going to defeat them, kill them, push them onto reservations. The African Americans, the Mexicans, every new immigrant group, they're dumb. They don't know anything. They're not worth their salt. They're not worth their bowl of rice, as the Chinese would say. So anyway, let me talk about a few of the amazing things that we found David, the intelligence that he had. Number one, when you were brought into this country, not brought in, when you came to this country through Angel Island on the West Coast, you had to pass a literacy test, as I mentioned before. Now, this shows you already that the psychiatrist saying that he couldn't read or was not literate and didn't know anything, that he's way off base. David could actually, even after the 31 years in the hospital, he was able to write Chinese calligraphy. Now, I don't know if you've ever tried to write Chinese calligraphy, but it is tremendously complicated. It's not like you figure out the phonetics and you know how to write English or most other languages. Okay. Secondly, we always tried to take David on field trips whenever we could on the weekends. And we took him to the Lincoln Park Zoo. I believe it was the Monkey House. And excuse me, outside the Monkey House, there's a plaque of all the donors. I don't know why I pointed to this one name of one donor, Montgomery, of the famous Montgomery Ward. I said, David, what does that say? And without hesitation, David said, Montgomery. Now, come on. He's illiterate. He can't speak. And he can read a big word like that, Montgomery. Later, we found out, showing him dollar bills and $5 bills, he could tell us that's Washington or that's Lincoln. David, how do you spell Washington? David could spell Washington faster than I could spell Washington. He could always recognize Lincoln and all the different pictures of Lincoln from his various times in life, without a beard, with a beard. We took him to Lincoln Memorial. Instantaneously, he knew that that's Lincoln. One time when David was in the hospital, and he went to the hospital many times, and we took care of him in the hospital. He was in a coma in the local hospital and had just recovered. I was so happy that he recovered, and he was out of the coma, and there was a dime on the floor. And David was always interested in looking at money, and I showed David the dime, and I said, David, who's that on the dime? David said, Roosevelt. When the doctor came in, I said, Doc, I've got really good news. Now, who is that on the coin? I asked the doctor. The doctor said, I don't know who that is. This was a Chinese doctor, but very smart, of course, to become a doctor. He said, I don't know. I said, David just told me that that's Roosevelt. The doctor said, I guess David is smarter than I am. And another time, another hospital, this is a sign now of David's ability to have fun, to interact with people, and that he had learned. I was walking David down the hallway of the hospital, and David's gown is flapping indiscreetly behind him, and we're walking past the nursing station, and all of a sudden, at the top of his lungs, I don't know if you know this song, but David started singing, standing on the corner. You know the next words to that song? Watching all the girls go by. And all the nurses behind the nurses station, they're all cracking up, laughing. And I mean, David had such a good sense of humor and enjoyed laughing and laughing with people. You can see in that picture there, he was enjoying singing so much. Now, standing on the corner, if I remember correctly, was I think it was about 1956. Now that's after David was put in the hospital. Now, how could he have learned that? And the doctors are saying he can't learn anything and he doesn't know any English. Now, as a matter of fact, after David got out of the hospital and he came here to the settlement house where he lived with San and myself, we also serve Vietnamese people and a lot of immigrants from different places. And I speak a little bit of Vietnamese myself, and San speaks Vietnamese and Chinese. There was this Vietnamese lady who lived down the block and was also a client of ours. And she used to teach David, Mo Kai Ba Bo Nam Sao Tam Bai Chin Mui, 1 through 10 in Vietnamese, if I got them right. Bai Tam Chin Mui, if I said that right. David was able to learn 1 through 10 in a totally different language. Already, David was trilingual, by the way. I don't know how many doctors and psychiatrists were trilingual, but David was already trilingual, and now he's learning a 4th language able to learn the fourth language. And the psychiatrist, upon David's release from the hospital, saying he can't learn anything. David could also, by the way, sing Chinese opera. And he knew other songs and songs that he heard only with us that he could repeat and sing along with. Vietnamese songs and English songs as well. There was another time we took him on a trip to Rockford, Illinois. Rockford is a place with a lot of steep hills. And we were going up and down these hills in Rockford. And all of a sudden, out of the blue, David said, Himalaya-san. That means Himalaya mountains. Now, I mean, my golly, David was an educated guy. San means mountain, and Himalaya-san is Chinese for Himalayas. What we say is Himalayas. In British accent, it's a little bit different. This is the stupid guy that they thought needed to be in the mental institution because he was a dumb guy and had no capacity to learn. They actually made him worse. And again, now I want to remind you and all of us that David is only one of tens of millions of people who are different, who were purposely excluded from the society, made into second, third-class citizens, mistreated, abused, and not allowed to become self-fulfilled. I only feel so bad that we were not able to help David sooner and get him out. But I also feel bad for all the people that did not get out, and people throughout history, and the people continuing until this day who are in that same plight. This is minorities around the world. If you use the word minority, you may understand David's situation. David was a minority, analogous to the blacks in America and in many places in the world, people of different color, people of different races, different ethnicities, LGBTQs. So what I would like to ask you, what can we do now? Okay, this is a great story. What have we learned from David? What have we learned from the history of what put David there? What lessons can we carry forward? Let's get the gray matter working here. Okay, number one, I think, at least I've learned that people, she had an answer for me, my cell phone. People who are different, that you may not be able to communicate with, are not necessarily dumb. They have potential. They're real people. They cry, they laugh, they have pain, they get hungry. They have desires. They love. They need love. They care. They want to be cared for. And I wish I could tell you all the stories about David. I mean, we grew to love David. And I guess he grew to love us as well. David, I remember one time we brought David on a field trip again, and I was walking out on this pier out on a river, the Fox River. It was a very narrow pier and long pier going out in the river. And David and San and other person who used to take care of David, were standing on the banks of the river. And David was yelling at the top of his lungs, "Ah, ah." He was afraid that I was going to fall. I mean, I felt so bad that David was fearful for my life. He used to bring me my slippers and my glasses every morning. When I tried to wake him up when he was sleeping late, he would say, 10 minnie, 10 minnie, 10 minnie. He wanted to sleep longer. I mean, this is just, it's what people do. David was a real person. We have to think of other people as real people. He was perhaps not able to speak with the nurses in the hospital and the psychiatrist on their level or in a different cultural way that they were used to. He could have been exhibiting different behaviors, or maybe he was incipient psychotic. But the way to help a person like that is not to put them in a psychiatric institution, isolate them with no help. So they did exactly the opposite, the wrong things instead of the right things to help him. And we're doing the same thing with minorities. We think they don't know anything. The Eastern Europeans and the Southern Europeans around the turn of the century were considered slow, dumb. How come they're not integrating as fast as we Northern Western Europeans? And the concept was that they should be the same as we. If they're not the same, we're not going to look into their history, into their circumstances. Why are they not integrating, in quotes, as fast? Well, they came from rural areas, less industrialized areas. And this is similar to people, say, from Mexico coming to this country, or from different parts of Asia with different languages. It's a more difficult thing to integrate. And when people have very different cultures, it makes it harder for them still to integrate. So if you, for instance, if you speak a Germanic language or a Latin language, it's easier for you to integrate in a country where you speak English. But if you speak Sinitic Sino language, it's much, much more difficult when the characters are not Roman characters, when you have a calligraphy like you do in China, or you have even Arabic script or Sanskrit, it's much, much more difficult, of course, to become integrated. When there's no relationship to Germanic or Latin languages, it's much more difficult. When you come from a traditional rural society, it's much more difficult. So anyway, what are some of the other things that we've learned? We've learned that this is not a new issue, it's a pattern. We have this pattern of treating people like that, which is counterproductive. If we can treat people with an attitude that people have a tremendous ability to expand, to be fulfilled, and to contribute. We are not losing, we're gaining, we're increasing the size of the pie, of the finite pie. This is not a zero-sum game, this is a positive-sum game. If we help, if we work with people who are different than us, we can be a much stronger country, society, world society, global society. These are the big things that we can learn from David. Now, how can we do things in our own lives? How can we take these lessons more to our own lives and put these things in practice? Well, you can do small things. You can be a good Samaritan. A good Samaritan is the guy that helped his enemy fallen by the roadside, even though that was a different guy, his enemy. And amazingly, that can be very rewarding, to help someone to be kind. Kindness hopefully came out of this discussion. Love for other people, no matter what they look like, even if they seem different than you, reach out to be kind. Secondly, I think that we can take this to the next step. If we're teachers, you put this in your lesson plans. If you're on the board of education, you put this in your curriculum. If you are a preacher, you put this in your sermon. If you are a legislator, you get this in the law. If you are in the judicial system and you're making judgments on people, how can you help people who were caught up in a system that made them the way they are? How can we utilize their soul, their body, their total capacity, instead of incarcerating and minimalizing what they have? We're going about this in the opposite way that we should be going. So, could you do me a favor and take that same survey again, 1 through 5? Do you have any more confidence in that something can be done? Do you feel a little bit less frustrated? Why don't you grade it 1 through 5? How frustrated do you feel now, or do you feel a little bit more empowered? Frustrated, most frustrated, 5, a little more empowered, 1. Okay. What is your answer? Okay, 2 to 3. We have an ability to help catapult change. Wonderful. Thank you so much. I feel so happy that we've changed some people, made some people more optimistic. I am optimistic. And I think that there are so many solutions out there that we are missing. And I hope you too can carry on the cause. And we each have to do our part in different ways. And we're Southeast Asia Center, and we've got a website. We've got a book coming out called The End of War. And it's a real, it's a not a fiction, it's a plan for bringing peace and harmony to the world. And we get a lot more into all of these things in that book. Thank you very, very much again. Take care now.